Well, thank you so much for coming. I know it's not always fun to talk about stress on a Friday morning, but I appreciate you being here, and we'll try to make it as fun as possible, just to kind of lighten the mood. Calvin and Hobbes was one of my favorite comics. This is not actually a great model of stress management. It's avoidance, but it is kind of funny that too much stress is unhealthy. He was right about that. So you heard a little bit about my background, but I started out working in schools. My background is in school psychology originally, and then kind of took a different path where now I'm working in an outpatient practice doing more clinical psychology, but my primary specialty is anxiety, which fits really well with stress. You know, I hear a lot about stress. Stress is a more common, not necessarily diagnosable condition like anxiety is, but there's a lot of overlap between the two. And so we'll be talking a lot about that today. And right now I'm working at a practice that's in Arlington. I do have business cards if you have questions after the talk and you want to contact me. They have my email, which is usually a really easy way to get in touch. So starting out, what is stress? We all probably know what stress feels like. You know, you can identify that sensation in your body when you're feeling stress, the tightness in your chest. Sometimes your stomach is churning, the feeling of adrenaline or your blood rushing through your body. But what is it really? It's your body's reaction to some sort of factor that's happening in the environment. It can be real or perceived, and that's really important because when kids experience stress, louder? Okay. When kids experience stress, the feeling is always real. So the stressor may or may not be. When we say it's real or perceived, it may be a threat that's not actually there. But the important thing to note is that the feeling, regardless, is real. So there are a lot of different sources of stress. The most common ones I have listed here, not necessarily in any order, although schoolwork is often a very common one. So this can be related to homework, which is often a really challenging time for parents and kids. High stakes exams that you hear a lot about, SOLs and things like that. Sometimes balancing school with extracurricular activities, time management can be very stressful, social life. Oftentimes for kids, transitions are a big challenge. So the start of the school year can be a really tough transition. Moving from elementary to middle school can be really stressful. Any of those times where big changes are occurring. Those are really kind of stressful for all of us, but particularly can be major sources of stress for children and teens. An interesting thing about stress is it doesn't have to be just bad. You know, we think of things that are stressful as negative life events, you know, parents separating or moving. But it can be a positive thing too that can be stressful. There are good things that happen in our lives that still cause stress, maybe due to the responsibility that comes along with them or some of the other factors of change that are happening. So knowing that even good things that are happening at times can be stressful. Sometimes stress is imposed by self-expectations, so kids' expectations of what their performance has to be. This, again, may be a perceived type of thing. Oftentimes I have parents saying, you know, we never created that kind of household at home where the expectation was you had to always get A's, but for some reason that's what my child believes. We'll talk later about technology. I know that's a really common question I get a lot these days is what's the impact of technology on stress? So we'll get into that a little bit more, and then sometimes current events and news and things like that. Before we move on, just out of curiosity, I know we've got a mix of people here today. If you're comfortable raising your hand, could I get a sense of how many people are here because they're parents? All right, so the majority. How about educators? Good, okay, so we've got, a mixture of people. So the majority of what we'll talk about today is really relevant to parents, but also to educators because a lot of the techniques and things that you'll hear are things that you as a teacher who might be interacting with children can implement as well or share with the parents at the schools where you work. So stress is a part of life, we know that. We all experience it at times, but when is it problematic? It's really problematic when it goes on for a long period of time and when it's excessive. So a little bit of stress, and we'll talk about this more, is actually not always a bad thing, but a lot of stress that goes on for long periods of time and isn't resolved or coped with effectively can become problematic. And really, you know, as psychologists, what we kind of designate as problematic is when something begins to impair your functioning. So a lot of times we think about behavior on a spectrum. You might have some of the symptoms of stress. If they're pretty mild and they're not impacting you, it's maybe not a very big deal at the time, or you can work on some of those coping management techniques. If it's to the point where it's impacting your ability to sleep or go to school or engage in social activities that you might typically enjoy, that's when it would become a problem. And we know that unresolved stress can be problematic in a lot of different areas. You know, it can affect not just mental health, but physical health as well. And we have some examples there. This is why we're here, and we're talking about what can we do to manage stress so that we can prevent a lot of these other concerns. So as far as recognizing stress in children and teens, it can often look very similar to what we experience as adults as stress, but it can also often look very different. One of the bigger things you'll see from kids is somatic complaints. So we as adults might have the vocabulary to say, I'm feeling really stressed about an upcoming project that I have at work. Kids may or may not have that ability to express themselves, and oftentimes what their stress looks like is the morning of a test, I have a stomach ache, or I feel like I'm going to be sick, or my head hurts. So those are things to look at, particularly, you know, once or twice, maybe it really is a stomach ache, but if you're starting to see a pattern of every time Monday morning rolls around, we have a stomach ache, that's a sign potentially of stress. And so that's a thing to look out for more in kids. Those somatic complaints tend to be more prevalent. Also, one of the interesting things with stress, you know, we think of stress oftentimes as adults kind of turning inwards. When you feel stress, that it's an internal feeling that maybe not necessarily everybody around us could identify. For kids, a lot of times it looks more like irritability and acting out. So some of those behaviors that you might not typically see, or that you might in other chances kind of view as non-compliance, can actually be related to stress. So when children are stressed, they're more likely, instead of being, you know, tearful and upset, to actually be more irritable and non-compliant. Other things you might look out for are just changes in general behavior. So changes in sleep or appetite from what's typical for your child, nervous habits. So there's, you know, nail biting and things like that that people do when they're stressed. Hair twirling or hair pulling can be a type of nervous habit associated with stress. Sometimes skin picking, and that's, you know, most people will say, well, my child has picked at a bug bite or picked at a scab. It's more so, you know, when it becomes routine and, you know, picking at skin to the point that it bleeds, that would be a nervous habit that could be related to stress. Sometimes difficulty concentrating. So it's important, you know, if we start to see some of those things, you know, as educators in school, when we see a child who suddenly has difficulty concentrating, who maybe didn't before, you know, the thing that a lot of people think about with difficulty concentrating is ADHD. But a lot of times inattention and lack of focus are actually related more so to anxiety. And we really want to know what kind of the underlying symptom is that's causing that inattention. Sometimes tearfulness, and then sometimes a weakened immune system, so more susceptibility to colds and things like that can be related to or a symptom of stress. So after we've identified that a child is stressed based on those symptoms, what do we do to help them with it? And that's really why we're here today, and that's what we'll spend the bulk of our time talking about. There are a lot of different things that we'll go through. The first thing that we'll do is just talking to your child about stress. Sometimes our natural tendency is to want to shield children from stress, hoping that they will never feel stressed, not wanting to demonstrate our own stress to children, so acting like we're not stressed even when we are, all with good intentions of this idea that we don't want our children to feel stressed. The challenge with that is that actually talking to children about stress helps them be more equipped to deal with stress. And particularly, there's been some research done where they look at if you teach children about the evolutionary purpose of stress and part of the good stress, and there is good stress, and we'll talk about that a little bit, that actually children are better equipped to cope with stress, which is really interesting that just understanding stress and how it works can help us be more equipped to deal with stress. So there is this idea of good stress, and I have some kind of visuals for kids as we move forward. The idea of stress is that it does serve this purpose. If we didn't feel stressed, if we didn't worry, we wouldn't look both ways before we crossed the street, we wouldn't study for the test that we had at the end of the week. A little bit of stress is actually a good thing. It helps us prepare for the things that are coming up. And even your body's reaction to stress is your body doing its job to help you prepare. And there's also been research on this that kids might find interesting, which is that when you have a little bit of that adrenaline, like going into a big test, that the performance is actually enhanced. Now, you don't want too much stress. It's sort of that Goldilocks effect of, too little is not good, too much is not good. You really want kind of that sweet spot in the middle. But if you do have some of that good stress, that it's actually there to help you perform. And then helping kids understand, in an age-appropriate way, how stress affects their body and where it occurs in the brain. So stress primarily occurs in the center of your brain called the amygdala. The really important thing to note is that your body is already equipped with ways of dealing with stress without us even doing anything. So we have what's called your sympathetic nervous system, and that's your fight or flight response. So most of us are familiar with that feeling if you're presented with a trigger that scares you. For me, a spider. I feel all of a sudden that adrenaline pumping through my body. That's my sympathetic nervous system. It's a perceived threat, not necessarily real, but it's causing my body to react. Now, the great thing is that you also have a parasympathetic nervous system just waiting there to do its job. What your parasympathetic nervous system does is, after a little bit of time, it kind of kicks into gear and says, oh, this was a false alarm, everything's okay, and it calms your body back down. So you have this complementary system in your brain that's really already there to help you through times of stress. The problem is a lot of times we don't give our brain a chance to do its job. So the sympathetic nervous system kicks into gear and it doesn't feel good. When you're stressed, nobody likes to feel stressed, and the reaction is, how do I get out of this stress? Whatever I can do to get rid of it. If it's escape the situation, if it's do something to make it feel more comfortable, we do that. And it works short term, but it doesn't do anything to actually help us adapt to the stressor because it cuts off that parasympathetic nervous system. Essentially, it doesn't give it a chance to do its job and to recognize, oh, this wasn't a real threat, everything is okay. And so helping your children kind of understand that their brain is already equipped to deal with stress can be somewhat empowering, helping them understand there are ways that you can learn to manage stress. And that's a really helpful thing, just kind of a dialogue to start with at home, which is that stress is a part of life. Our goal is never going to be to avoid it completely, because that's impossible. It's really going to be to view it as something that we can work to manage more effectively. And that's just kind of that model that we'll talk about as we go forward, that stress is there, it comes and goes, our goal is to learn how to manage it. In reframing stress, you might help children see that some opportunities of stress are actually there to help you grow. And sort of, I compare it a lot to your immune system. I work a lot with people with OCD. One of the types of OCD is contamination and this fear of germs. And most of us know that if you avoid germs entirely, that actually you tend to get sick more often. And that's because your immune system doesn't have a chance to do its job. It's not able to build up its tolerance to those germs to help you fight them off when you need to. And that's true essentially of your coping system for stress too. If it doesn't get exercised, if it doesn't have a chance to do its job, it doesn't get any stronger. And so helping your child see that we can view, especially some of these low stress times, as opportunities to grow and become better at adapting to stress. So for young kids, sometimes I think it's helpful to just have a visual of that. This is, your kind of classic bell curve, but it's that idea we were just talking about. We call, in the literature, they call positive stress eustress. That's what you see in the middle. It's where you have kind of that optimal level of stress that's there to enhance your performance. It helps you focus better. It helps you feel more energized and attentive. Too much stress, we know, is bad, and that's the one side of the bell curve that leads to all the symptoms that we talked about earlier. But also what this bell curve shows is that too little stress is not necessarily all that helpful either. It can lead to feelings of boredom, lack of attention, and so ideally we're looking for that kind of middle ground. And then for younger kids, I just thought that this was a helpful graphic just to kind of go over some of these things and then categorize, this idea of there is good stress and then there is bad stress. So just something that you might use if you have, a younger elementary school student in talking through some of these things. So our first goal in helping kids cope with stress is really talking about stress and then understanding the purpose of stress and good stress. Along those lines, one of the things that we can help children do is establish a growth mindset. So a growth mindset is that idea we were talking about, that things are not fixed. It's not, if I'm stressed now, I'm going to be stressed forever and it's never going to get better. It's this idea of this is a learning opportunity, I can grow from it and do better in the future. And that locus of control, that's your sense of control over a certain situation. The reason why a growth mindset is helpful is that it makes you feel that you have more control, particularly over situations that are outside of your control. Because as we went through that list earlier, a lot of those sources of stress, the sources may be outside of our control. How we respond to them is within our control. One of the things that can be helpful, one of the cognitive distortions that typically goes along with stress, we call it catastrophizing or catastrophic thinking. It's essentially exactly what it sounds like, imagining that worst case scenario. So perhaps a test feels really challenging. Your child comes home and says, I think I failed, I'm going to get a failing grade in the class, I'm never going to be able to get into college, and I'm going to have to live at home in your basement forever. That would be a really good example of catastrophizing. It's helpful to name that and say, this is a common cognitive distortion. We all have cognitive distortions. It's when your brain is telling you things that aren't necessarily true or helpful, and label it for what it is. That's catastrophizing. Even just that sense of labeling a cognitive distortion is empowering, and it helps you separate from the thought a little bit, because when we have a thought in our head, we automatically attach ourselves to it, right? It's your thought, it feels real, it occurred in your head, it feels like it's there for a reason. If we can kind of label that thought as, okay, that's one of those catastrophizing thoughts, I know what those are, we can get a little bit of separation from it, which is helpful because then we can look at it a little bit more objectively. So after we've named and validated the emotion, then we can process through it. Now, a lot of times what we do is some rationalizing, which some rationalizing is not a bad thing. That idea of, okay, so catastrophizing, there's that worst case scenario. What's another possible scenario? There are a lot of different ways we can look at this. And that's something you can engage your child in together. It's sort of a problem solving approach. Okay, that's one way of thinking about it, but let's put on our creative thinking cap and think about what are some other ways we can think about it. We can also face that worst case scenario, and sometimes using humor in this is actually helpful. And that's where you can say, you can kind of go along with it and help them face that fear of, okay, so you're going to live in my basement forever, what do you want it to look like? And the idea is that you kind of bring in some humor to the situation, which helps lighten the mood a little bit. It also helps them again see that maybe that thought is not entirely rational. One of the things with rationalizing that we do want to avoid, though, is an excessive amount of something that we call reassurance. So when I say a little bit of rationalizing is okay, you might help your child initially think through the thought, kind of challenge it, maybe recognize what are some other solutions here. So maybe the example is, I don't think I did very well on my test. What are some other options? Well, I could go talk to my teacher after I get it back. I could ask about test corrections. We could talk about things that went wrong so that I could learn from it for next time, and I could do as well as I can in the rest of the class, and maybe I end up with a B, and that's okay. So that's another way of thinking about it. After you go through that, though, what you want to avoid is doing a lot of what we call reassurance. Reassurance would be like every time your child is worried about something, maybe after you have this conversation, they go to bed, then they come out of bed and they say, so are you sure I'm not going to live in your basement forever? And you say, oh, no, you're not. It's okay, don't worry about it. And then the next day they come back and, are you sure? Like, what if I fail all my classes and I never get into college? Oh, you're going to be fine. And it sounds like, you're just helping them in the moment. It's a natural thing for us to want to do, especially when we see someone else feeling anxious. The problem with reassurance is that it gets a little bit addictive, and it actually inadvertently kind of validates the worry a little bit because you're treating it like it's true. and you're giving that reassurance, which then it's sort of like it starts out small, but you need more and more of it over time. So that's where you can, also have that conversation with your child of, we already had that conversation. I understand that you're still feeling worried about it, but I can't give you any reassurance about it because that'll just feed the worry, and I don't want to do that. So we'll just kind of face it together. So that's a thing to kind of be on the lookout for, because reassurance often goes hand in hand with stress or anxiety. Some other things that you can help your child with: guided problem solving. So the idea here, this example that I gave of your child comes home and talks through this situation with you, first time around, it might be the goal that you're guiding them through it together. Okay, so how do we think about ways of handling this situation? But ideally, more and more passing over the reins of doing that to your child. So it's sort of a scaffolding approach. A lot of times there's that temptation to kind of jump in and save the day of, I see you're feeling worried, I'll call your teacher, we'll talk about it, we'll get a plan in place. And while that's, an understandable wanting to be helpful approach, it's not giving the child an opportunity to learn from the experience and work through it together. So starting with more involvement, and then especially as your child gets a little bit older, gradually fading back some of that involvement and allowing them to do some of the problem solving on their own. So one of the questions I get a lot about stress is something called resilience. So there's this thing called resilience. What makes people resilient, and can resilience be learned? The good news is yes. There's some research to say that there is, some biological factors that are there that designate resilience, at birth, but that more and more it can be learned and reinforced. So things that help with building resilience, and resilience is that ability really to bounce back from stress. So not to never have stress, not to ever feel stress, but to bounce back from stress when stress does occur. Things that help with resilience: having strong emotional connections, and that's true, between you and your children at home, but also really fostering those connections outside of the home too. So in really challenging your kids to build those connections with coaches, mentors, teachers, peers, those can be really helpful in building your resilience. Another thing that's helpful with resilience is encouraging kids to be brave. This is a lot of what I do working with kids with anxiety. So a lot of times the response to anxiety, and that's what you heard Valerie say, that I do something called exposure and response prevention. Exposure is sort of what it sounds like. It's gradually facing your fears, and that's a response to anxiety that involves teaching kids to be brave and gradually face their fears so that they have less of an impact on their life. There's some really interesting research out there where they've looked at models of behavior, and so they've given kids who are anxious a model of someone who, think of, your classic superhero. They're not afraid of anything. They just do whatever they need to do in the face of danger, and they're brave, and that's what we're taught. That's what bravery is. We're not afraid, and we go headstrong into danger without another care in the world. And then they've given them another model, which is someone who's fearful and has to face their fear and feels pretty uncomfortable when they're doing it, but gradually faces their fear, and it gets easier and easier over time. And if you had to guess, who do the anxious kids relate more to? So the fearful model, right. So it's really hard for anxious kids or stressed kids to relate to the people who don't feel any stress. So all of those superheroes that we think of as, great role models, we actually really want to have this, we call it a coping model. So a coping model is someone who does feel scared sometimes, does feel stressed, but has ways of pushing themselves to overcome that stress. Kids really identify more with that, and they learn more from it. Do you have a question?
I was going to say slightly off topic, but related to, as a mother of boys, my boys were initially drawn to the traditional Army stories or war stories, where it was a regular person who was, overcoming the anxiety. But then I found they were getting a lot of pushback from society from playing Army and war models and all this, where, because it was perceived as violence, but really it was saving and overcoming the anxiety. So how do you then model bravery in a way that is going to be societally accepted for a boy as opposed to a girl, because, you know, the girl's got that whole, like, Frozen aspect, you know, of bravery. But the boys are always being told not to be brave now, or at least in this situation where they used to model in previous generations.
Yeah, that's a good question. Essentially, how do we look for those kinds of models? One of the easiest ways to do it is to be that model at home. And so that would be, you know, what I was saying earlier, that a lot of times we try to hide stress from our kids and act as if we're not stressed, really because we're trying to protect them. But the idea being that when you're stressed, you can talk to your child about it. So let's say you're me and you're coming to give a talk today and you feel kind of anxious about it. And you're telling your child, you know, I have to stand up in this room full of people, and, you know, when I do that, before I get there, I feel my heart beating really fast and I feel my stomach churning a little bit. That's my adrenaline. That's because I'm feeling a little bit anxious. And here's what I tell myself to do it. And here are the reasons why I challenge myself to do it when I could just choose not to, because I know that it helps me overcome that fear, and that the more that I do it, the easier it gets. So the easiest model is yourself, you know, to look for those opportunities where at home, whether, you know, you or other members of the family are going and doing challenging things, and to really talk about it with your child. That can be a really helpful way to bring it home. And then as far as the things in, you know, society, I think a lot of it is kind of looking for those models of overcoming fears in, you know, developmentally appropriate ways. And so what that can look like, you know, stories about going to middle school for the first time, and you know, looking for some of those types of resources that may be relatable. Not that the war stories are bad in any way, but I kind of understand your concern that people might view it as such, but maybe looking for things that are more relatable, and even, you know, being able to talk to your child and encourage them to kind of find supportive groups where they can talk to other people about how they overcome their fears. But I would say the easiest way to kind of bring that kind of value home is to do it together as a family, and to even think about things that might push you outside of your comfort zone, things that you might do as a weekend activity. You know, let's all go to the rock climbing wall, even though, you know, mom is afraid of heights, but let's talk about what it feels like and what it's like to gradually work on facing our fears, and how hard it is at first and how it gets easier over time. So looking for ways that you can do it as a family can be a really helpful way to introduce that. As far as working on some of those things with facing fears, sometimes it's really hard to face a fear, and one way that you can help your child do that is to try to break it down into more manageable steps. So teaching them, it's a skill, teaching them chunking, which is that when something feels too overwhelming, you break it down into more manageable pieces. One of the things that when you're talking to your kids about fear that you also want to do is to try to avoid arguing about fears. This is something that inherently we kind of want to rationalize with a fear. One of the things I always tell people is that fears are like toddlers. They're irrational to begin with, and if you try to rationalize with them, you're not really going to get anywhere. If you've ever had an argument with a toddler who is 2 and wants ice cream, you could give them the best thesis you've ever come up with about why they shouldn't have the ice cream. At the end of the argument, they still want the ice cream. And that's kind of what our fears are like. They're irrational to begin with, so they don't really respond to rationalization. This, you know, many of us as adults can identify with that of, I don't know why I'm afraid of this, I know that I am, and I know it's kind of silly, but it still feels really uncomfortable. So helping kids understand, we're not going to argue with the fear, we're not going to say that the fear doesn't have value or merit because the fear feels real. We're just going to work on gradually facing it. Another thing you can do is reward brave behavior. People worry a little bit about rewards. If you give too much extrinsic reinforcement, does that discourage intrinsic motivation, your internal motivation? Interestingly, one of the things we know is if you give a lot of external reinforcement for accomplishments, it can affect your motivation. But if you give reinforcement for effort and attempts and working at things, it actually encourages internal motivation. So when we think about rewarding brave behavior, that effort is what we're rewarding, and it actually encourages children to continue to be brave. So we don't have to worry, and I have people ask me, am I bribing my child to face this fear? It's really not bribery. It's really giving them external motivation to do something that's really hard, and it helps them build that internal motivation over time. And then we already talked a little bit about reassurance seeking, but that's important with fears too, where we don't want to get too much into that trap of giving a lot of reassurance. Another thing that helps with building resilience is allowing children to make mistakes, learn from those mistakes, and have this idea of I'm not avoiding failure. So a lot of times with kids who are stressed, we see if I'm afraid that I might not be able to do it well, I just won't do it at all. And that might be with a new sporting activity or a new club that they really do want to join, but there's this fear of I may not be able to do it well, so I'm just not going to try. That's failure avoidance, and it's not very adaptive long term. It keeps people from doing things they want to do and need to do, and it also doesn't help children learn that making mistakes is okay. So looking for ways that we can allow children to make what we call safe mistakes. So with young children, it might be allowing them to carry your breakable plates to the dining room table and set the table, knowing that the temptation is to not let them do it because what happens when they drop one, it breaks. But then they learn, okay, I broke this plate, it's kind of a bummer, but it's okay. And that's actually a good learning opportunity for kids to try to do things that are a little outside of what we call their zone of proximal development. Your zone of proximal development is kind of where you are today. What we want to do is take one step out of that because it challenges us to do a little bit more, which sometimes means that you make a mistake and you learn that that's okay, but it's also how you learn how to do these things that are harder. So looking for opportunities for kids to do that and not always jumping in when it's tempting to save them from making a mistake. So maybe you see that if they don't check their backpack before they go to school tomorrow, that homework assignment is going to be left on the desk and it's going to be forgotten. And it's a very easy fix. You just say, oh, check your desk, make sure you go through your backpack and make sure you have everything, and then you can go to school and be prepared. That is one way to be prepared. However, it's not allowing children to figure out what works for them in terms of doing their own system of checking and making sure that they had that experience of learning from that mistake. So maybe it means they do forget their homework at home one time. They have to tell their teacher about it. Their teacher talks to them about it, and then they work through, okay, what do I do next time? And then they learn from that experience. So it can be really tempting to jump in and save kids from bad things happening, but in doing so, they don't get an opportunity to build resilience, which doesn't mean we're going to let them, run out in the street or do anything that's not safe. We're going to look for small ways that they can challenge themselves and those safe mistakes that they can make. And then the last thing for building resilience, also this idea of cognitive reframing. We talked about that a little bit already with the cognitive distortions. Nurturing optimism, this idea of how do we kind of challenge some of our thinking. Not saying you always have to be blindly optimistic and believing that the best is going to happen, but maybe that you recognize that if you're thinking towards the worst case scenario, that there are other options out there. There are more positive things that could happen. There are neutral things that can happen, and practicing challenging and using that cognitive flexibility to think about things in different ways. A few last things for building resiliency. Helping children build competence and mastery. So this would be identifying the things that your kids do well and really challenging them to do those things and grow, and really reinforcing them, recognizing their small successes. So one of the things that we know that helps with resilience is finding those strengths and doing the things that you do well and being recognized for those. So really encouraging your kids in the area where they're successful. And providing specific labeled praise. So one of the interesting things we've found is that in terms of encouraging kids in building competence, External motivators, like, I'll give you $1 every time you do that, really aren't all that powerful. Actually, labeled praise for the good things that they've done is actually a lot more powerful, and it's free, so that's nice. We always want to try to reinforce effort rather than achievement. So the idea being that achievement is not always within your locus of control. So you may study really hard for a test. It may be the hardest test that you've ever taken. You might have a professor, like I did in undergrad, who said he had never given an A in his entire career, and he was very old. So you may study as hard as you want, but you're not going to get that A. If we only reinforce achievement, we miss out on all of these other things that our children are doing to work hard, and achievement is not always within our control. There are some things that you can control, and there are some things that you can't. You can control the effort that you put forth. So you really want to reinforce children's effort versus their achievement. If you see them studying really hard, but they still get a B, reinforcing, I really like how you used your study skills and spent time working towards that test, more so than you are concerned about the grade itself. And then promoting contribution, both at home and in the community, is helpful. This is that idea of giving back. At home, it can be in small ways, participating in the family. And then in the community, we know that kids who are taught to give back and be involved in their community are more resilient than kids who are not. So we talked a little bit about that idea of making safe mistakes. What happens when a child does make a safe mistake is that we want to try to help them learn from it. So learning from your mistakes, in research they found, actually helps build effort next time around and motivation. So that's why having those opportunities for mistakes are so important. One thing you might do is provide examples of your own mistakes and how you've learned from them in the past, and then also trying to watch your reaction to mistakes, which is easier said than done at times, but being able to particularly identify what are some of those safe mistakes that my child can make, and when he or she makes them, can I react in a way that says, this was a small thing that's easily overcome and we can learn from it. So essentially, in your reaction to the mistake, teaching them how they can react to mistakes in the future. Teaching this idea of progress, not perfection. A lot of times, I mentioned earlier that stress can be caused by self-expectations. I see this a lot in the population that I work with, of people with anxiety, a lot of expectations of I have to do everything perfectly. The problem with that is that when you think that you have to do something perfectly, it actually makes you want to do it less, because the idea of getting started and doing it perfectly is so overwhelming that you don't even want to get started. And so having that view of perfection is actually not that helpful. I have people who don't always understand what I do, and hear that I work with people with OCD who have this perfectionistic mindset of, I wish my kid wanted to be perfect about homework. And you really don't, because wanting to be perfect about homework means sometimes spending, twice as long as you should on homework, or not doing it at all, because the idea of doing it perfectly is so overwhelming that you can't get started. So you actually really want to reinforce that idea of progress and moving forward, learning, making steps and making gains, not doing things perfectly. We already talked about not rescuing your kids from mistakes, because they're a good thing to be able to experience. You also want to praise kids for taking ownership of their mistakes. Natural childhood temptation when you make a mistake is to say he did it, mostly because of the fear of consequences. But actually what we want to teach children is that owning up to their mistakes is a really helpful thing to be able to do in order to learn from their mistakes and move forward. And you really want to praise your children when they do learn from their mistakes and they overcome these challenges. So in terms of how do we reinforce effort, I mentioned that reinforcing your effort actually helps with motivation versus reinforcing achievement does not necessarily. It also helps children change their mindset towards learning. So if you focus more on reinforcing effort, they have more buy-in to their involvement in the learning process, and they're more likely to take ownership and responsibility for their part in the learning process, and it motivates and empowers them to work harder. And as I mentioned before, praise is actually a really effective motivator. Praising kids for working hard and putting forth effort is really important. And our idea here is, sometimes it can be really hard to quantify effort. So I have people ask, well, it's easy to reinforce an A because an A comes on a piece of paper and I know what that looks like. How do I really know how much effort my child is putting forth? And that's where you might agree on some of these things together. What does effort look like? What does it mean for you to study for your test? What is the expectation of how much time you should spend or how you should go about doing it? And then reinforcing them for following through on the plan. So some of this might be shaping for your children what that effort looks like and talking about it ahead of time so that you do know what to reinforce. Is it? Oh. Should I give it? Okay.
Let's see if I can real quick.
Okay. While we get the technology sorted out, another thing that goes hand in hand with stress is executive functioning skills. You probably hear a lot about these today. People talk a lot about executive functioning skills, often related to things like ADHD, but executive functioning skills we all have. One of the things I always like to kind of give as a disclaimer when I'm talking to parents of younger children is that your executive functioning skills all take place in your frontal lobe of your brain, so right up here in the front. And does anybody know how the brain develops? Back to front. Yep, that's the last to develop. And you know about when it's done developing? 25, yeah. So you guys have heard a lot about this before. The reason I bring that up is it's encouraging to know our kids' brains are still developing. If they don't have all of these skills, I don't need to panic yet. Yep.
Isn't that later in men?
Things
28 to 36, I think was the research.
Things tend to be a little later in men, the development at times. Yes, so I mean in general, that's kind of a general number, but what we know is it's a lot later than we used to expect. So we used to think 18 is adulthood, that's when you can vote, that's when you can move out of your parents' house, that's when you can do all of these adult responsibilities, but actually what the research and the science shows is that you're really not an adult at that point. You're really not able to make those good decisions until a little bit later in your development. Now, this is not to say you can't do things to work on executive functioning skills. So it's not a lost cause. You're not waiting until your children get into their 20s and just saying there's nothing that I can do. There are things that we can do to work on executive functioning, but just to know that when there are those moments when you feel frustrated, like how could you not have thought of that, that there are reasons, biological reasons, why it's harder for our kids to plan ahead and think about things than it is for us as adults with fully developed brains. We break executive functioning skills mainly into these three categories: your working memory, your inhibitory control, your impulses, and then your cognitive or mental flexibility. And there's a kind of circular relationship with stress and executive functioning. So if you have better executive functioning, you're less likely to be stressed. That's the good part of it. If you have stress, that can impair your executive functioning. So the good news is that executive functioning is kind of a helpful barrier to stress. So that's the positive side of it. But we also know that when somebody is stressed, that they might not be using their executive functioning skills as effectively as they would be if they're not feeling stressed. So what can we do to actually help build executive functioning skills? So a lot of this is modeling and then looking for opportunities to do it together. So one of the ways to do this is to work with your child to set goals and then develop plans towards these goals. A great example of doing this would be for things like projects. So projects tend to be a big challenge because they're long periods of time. They're usually over several weeks or a month, depending how big the project is. They usually involve multiple different steps, and they're usually given, in September. They're due in October, and depending on what grade your child is, there might not be a lot that's done in between. This is the project, this is when it's due. And if you know those executive functioning skills and that there are some challenges with those, the likely temptation is, I'm working on this project the night before it's due, which of course is very stressful. So that's something that we want to avoid. So an idea of how you might teach some of these executive functioning skills with a project, for example, is, okay, the project is assigned today. Let's sit down tonight and look at when it's due. Okay, let's look at all the steps that are involved. One way that's kind of helpful to have your child do this is imagine that they're explaining it to somebody else. So imagine you're explaining your project to your best friend. What are the things that your friend needs to do to get the project done? By thinking about it and how they explain it to somebody else, it can help them break it down into individual steps. So you work with the child, what are the individual steps? You write them out on paper. Okay, so if our due date is this date, when do we need to have this step done by? And kind of working your way backwards from that. Writing out a schedule and then working with your child to stick to the schedule to complete the project. Initially, that probably sounds like a lot of work at first. The idea, again, is scaffolding. You do it together the first time, maybe the first couple times, and then gradually you kind of give the reins over to your child, knowing that they then have the tools to do that themselves and they can work on implementing those techniques. And you might still, for a while check in with them and see that they're sticking to the plan and then gradually fade that out, particularly as they get older and further along in school. So that's one practical way that you might do it from a school standpoint. Using schedules and checklists for organization. So working with your child to kind of keep track of the things that they need to do. I'm always surprised these days, most of us probably grew up at the time where they gave you a planner or you bought a planner and you wrote everything down in your planner and you checked it off after you did it. They don't do that anymore. Everything is online, which is also really challenging, particularly for kids with difficulties with executive functioning. So they might have to log in to Blackboard and every teacher posts their homework somewhere different, not intentionally, teachers aren't trying to do this, it's just the system that they do. But for children who have difficulty with executive functioning, organizing all of that is really challenging. And so I'm old school and I still recommend that you have one place where you keep it all, whether it's a planner that you write it all down in or something else, but that at the beginning of homework, for example, you teach your child to go in, collect all the different information from all the different sources, put it in one place where it's less likely to get lost or disorganized, and then check it off as you go, because it's way too easy to let things slip through the cracks if they're not all in one place.
Do you have any advice for encouraging the child to use the planner? Because at my daughter's school, she is given a planner at the beginning of the year. She's told to use it. She has 7 different teachers, 7 different classes, all scattered throughout the building. And, she comes home and she doesn't have anything written down in the planner. She doesn't look at the planner. Sometimes I see the teacher seems to have written down Post-it notes with all sorts of, like, this is due in, different places. But she says, I don't need a planner. I got it. I don't need that. She's consistently refuses to use it. Now in grade school, the homeroom teacher was willing for me to sign it every single day, make sure she wrote all the assignments down and then sign it, which my daughter found, of course, mortifying, embarrassing. But now in middle school, that's not something that we can do.
Right. It does get harder because you're not there, yes, and if they won't use it. So some things that I found that work for a child that won't use a planner, if the teacher will allow it, is every kid has a phone these days. Most of the time they write something on the board for what the homework is. That's what you're supposed to copy in your planner. So I've had certain kids take pictures of the assignments. If you're not allowed to use a phone, that makes it more challenging. But if you can kind of talk with the teacher about maybe using that as an accommodation if you're only allowed to bring it out just to take the picture, so it is at least all in one place. If not, there are ways that you might say, sometimes with kids that I'm working with, I'll say, that's great that you don't think that you need the planner. Let's try it, 2 weeks your way, and we'll try it 2 weeks my way. And we're going to treat it like a science experiment. You could write it up for your science project if you want to. There you go, your idea's already done. Let's write our hypothesis of who we think is going to be right, who we think is going to be more effective, and then let's collect data on it every day and see how it goes. And I try to get their buy-in, kind of joking about it, this idea of, okay, I understand your point of view, I understand that you don't think that you need it, I understand that if I don't have your buy-in, you're not going to use it, so I have to get your buy-in somehow. So usually I try to go about it from a collaborative standpoint, and oftentimes that scientific approach of let's see how it works your way. Sometimes if you can talk with teachers, I know it gets harder once you're in middle school because they don't, you've got 7 different classes and 30 kids in each class, it's hard to make sure every kid is writing down the homework. Sometimes if you can find a way to at least make sure that they are putting everything online, and then when your child gets home, you can set aside, kind of setting that expectation of, okay, if you don't write everything in your planner, that's your choice, but then when you get home, we're going to spend 10 minutes after you've had your snack sitting down and going through and writing it all down together. And that idea sometimes of, okay, you can take ownership of it earlier or we can do it together. It's kind of your choice of how you want to do it. So that's one way to go about it, but usually I find if there's some way that I can get their buy-in, it's more likely that it's going to happen. But I know that this is a challenge, particularly as kids are getting older.
Yeah, if your child goes to Kilmer, they have a class called Strategies for Success, and that
Try again.
yeah, it's helped with our daughter because she was the same.
Was she willing to take that class though? Because my daughter didn't want to take it.
It wasn't optional. Okay.
Good for you.
Executive function skills, really challenging.
They are challenging. As far as other ways we can help kids build them, so there are games that help with executive functioning. Even some of those old school games that we used to play, like memory, that is a game of working memory. It sounds like it's just a game where you pick up pieces and you try to remember where they were, but actually that is an executive functioning skill. Things like Monopoly, which I don't know if anybody plays that anymore, but there's a lot of executive functioning in planning what you're going to do with your money so that you don't run out of it in the end. So even using it, it doesn't have to always be school oriented, and it doesn't have to always be this battle of boring stuff. You can look for ways to incorporate games and talk about the executive functioning skills that you're using while you're playing. So the game itself is fun, but even talking it through as you're playing Monopoly and you're making your move, you demonstrating your own executive functioning of, I'd really like to buy that property, but as I look at what I have here, I think if I buy that property, it wouldn't be a very good decision for what I have to do next. And so even kind of modeling some of those executive functioning skills in fun ways can be helpful too. Helping your child learn organizational skills. We like to think that we all come with those programmed, but most of us know that we don't. It's harder to stay organized than we would like to admit, and it takes time and effort. And so helping your child start the year organized, having a system where everything goes in its certain place, but then also teaching your child to set a weekly time where they reorganize everything, because you might start out the year really organized, but then you're busy changing from one class to the next and you start shoving things in your backpack, and before you know it, the organizational system is lost. So teaching your child, okay, even if it's 10 minutes on a Sunday, it's not that long, we're going to take everything out, we're going to put it back in its place, because it's a lot easier to do that as we go rather than to do it once the whole system has fallen apart. And then helping your child break the homework into more manageable chunks. So I mentioned a little bit with that perfectionism that getting started on homework can be hard. Getting started on homework can always be hard, particularly the more and more homework that your child has. The idea of getting started can become very overwhelming. So helping children break it into more manageable chunks so that they can think of it as, I can do a little bit, take a break, do a little bit, take a break. And really kind of setting that schedule in place. The thing I would recommend is breaks. You don't ever want to involve technology, because if you're trying to take a 5-minute break with technology, it easily becomes 30 minutes. So really kind of setting a schedule and even using a timer. When the timer dings after 20 minutes, we're going to take our break, but we're going to set a break. We're going to set a timer for the break too, because that's going to help cue us to get back to the work. But trying to break it down into those more manageable chunks, trying to teach children to start with what's hard first. A lot of kids have, and we all kind of do this in our daily life, we do the things that are easier to do, and then we put off the things that we really don't want to do until later. By putting them off, that avoidance, they get harder and harder and harder to think about doing. So teaching your child to start with something that's challenging and then reward themselves with something that's a little bit easier or more fun, however fun homework can be a helpful way to kind of knock out those subjects that are really challenging and most likely to cause a lot of stress. Because if you save those for the end, particularly when you're burnt out and exhausted, they become even more challenging. Helping your child learn study skills. I know you mentioned there's a class maybe for organization at some of the middle schools, and there are study skills classes, which I highly recommend. You know, study skills are not innate. We think that they should be, but they're not necessarily. We have to learn how to be effective studiers. And if there is a class, you know, encouraging your child to take it. If not, teaching and modeling some of those skills at home. So what the research shows is that passive studying is not very effective. We've all probably been there where you're sitting there reading a piece of paper, you get to the end of the paper and you realize, I have no clue what I just read. I wasn't paying any attention, I was thinking about what I was going to cook for dinner, and I don't know anything that was on that piece of paper. Well, a lot of kids, the only way they know how to study is to take out their notes and stare at them. And you can imagine how effective that is. Active studying is a lot more effective, but most kids don't know how to do this unless you teach it to them. So teaching your child ways of active studying. One of the most effective active studying skills is teaching. Teachers probably know this, you know, that they know the material that they teach in and out because they have to. They have to put it in their brains, they have to synthesize it in a way that they can then explain it and deliver it to somebody else, which really helps them understand it. That's true for kids too. So one of the ways that you might help them learn to study their material is to imagine that they're teaching it. So they have to put it in their own words. This is very different from passively reading a piece of paper and just reading the words on the page. They have to be able to incorporate it, understand it, and then relay it in a way that makes sense to somebody else. That's one of the most effective study strategies that we have. Encouraging active reading. This is, you know, for studying, but also kind of throughout the semester to help the child be more effective when studying comes. I don't know about you, but I know when I first started using highlighters, I thought that they were like tracking devices, and I just highlighted every word as I went, which of course is not very effective. The idea of active reading is that you're thinking about the material that you're reading, you're pulling out what's important. Some of the ways to do this, you know, they teach this before the SAT. You should always read the questions before you read the passage. There's some truth to that. You know, you should preview what it is that you're being expected to know before you read, because that helps you pay attention to the stuff that's really going to matter. You can look at headlines and bolded text and things like that to give you context clues as far as what's important. But the idea is teaching your child at the end of every paragraph, after they read the paragraph, thinking about, okay, what do I think that I needed to know from that? What was the important message? How would I summarize that? Teaching them that skill early is really helpful, because the more effectively they're reading, the more prepared they're going to be when the test comes around. Teaching chunking information. So nobody memorizes phone numbers anymore, but there's a reason they're 7 digits. It's because that's what the average person holds in working memory is 7 digits. But they're chunked 3 and 4. And that's because they're easier to remember that way. And once upon a time, we actually had to know people's phone numbers. So chunking information is actually a really helpful memory strategy. Grouping it into meaningful parts helps children synthesize that information and remember it more effectively than if you're looking at the information as a whole. And then trying to make connections. So the more relatable you can make the material, the more helpful it is to remember it later. So sometimes that might be things like mnemonic devices, other kind of clever ways to remember it. Sometimes it can be making personal connections. Okay, how can I remember this piece of information? How can I relate it to something that I've experienced myself? All of these skills are going to help children be more effective studiers. The reason that this is important, not just for executive functioning skills, but the more prepared children feel, the less stress they're going to feel. So helping them be prepared for studying, even if it's not necessarily always taught in school, these are some of the things that you can help teach at home. And then teaching and modeling flexible thinking, so that one of those other areas of executive functioning is your kind of cognitive flexibility. Ways that you can teach flexible thinking, playing word games or things that involve play on words, you know, using words where it's the same word, it sounds the same, but there are 2 different meanings. Those are good ways to practice the flexible thinking, trying new ways of doing everyday things. So even making that a game of, you know, this is how we typically walk to school together, but what is another way that we could walk? what is another way that we could walk and get there at the same time, making it a fun game. Teaching self-talk skills, so how do I talk myself through some of these challenging situations, and then even making up new rules for games. So it may be a typical board game you've always played a certain way. We pull it out and say, okay, it's your turn to make up a new rule for the game. Everybody has to play by that rule. And the whole idea is it's really challenging your flexible thinking. We all have a tendency to kind of get into a certain line of thinking and kind of stay there, but those flexible thinking skills are really helpful, particularly in school, but in other areas of life too. So teaching them in fun and creative ways. Things that also help with stress, most of us do better with a schedule. A lot of us think that we don't, but as people, we really in general do better with some sort of schedule. One of the things I always recommend is prioritizing basic needs, the things that tend to go first when you're stressed. Unfortunately, one of them is sleep. Of course, this is also a really vicious cycle where the less sleep you get, the more stressed you feel. The more stressed you feel, the more you might compromise sleep, and you see where it goes from there. So making sure that you really have that example of no matter how much homework we have, no matter how stressful it is, there are certain things that we don't compromise because that's how we are healthy as people. And if we're not healthy as people, then we can't cope very effectively with stress. Easier said than done, avoiding overscheduling. We're all probably overscheduled at this point, but trying to really kind of set that model of extracurricular activities and things are wonderful. If you add in something new, though, it might mean that you have to compromise something else. Really setting that expectation of we're not going to overschedule to the point that we're borrowing from sleep or other things that are really important. As far as stress in the morning, having a morning routine that everybody kind of sticks to is really helpful, doing as much as you can the night before, and then teaching some self-responsibility. So depending on the age of your child, what that might look like, it could be picking out their own clothes, it could be making their own breakfast, depending on age, but having some self-responsibility built into that morning routine helps children be set up for success for a good day. I mentioned sleep. Sleep and stress often go hand in hand. When you're stressed, sometimes if you want to sleep, you can't sleep, and that's where sleep hygiene comes into play. So sleep hygiene is what they call just all the strategies that help promote effective and healthy sleep. Things that are always recommended for sleep hygiene, having set bedtimes and wake times, even on weekends. This is challenging, particularly, Friday night your child goes to a sleepover and stays up till 2 in the morning and then, wants to sleep until 11 o'clock in the afternoon. There's that kind of really tricky battle of, do I let them get the 9 hours of sleep that I know that they need, but then they're not going to be able to fall asleep on Saturday night. Their sleep cycle is going to be totally off. So what we know from a sleep hygiene standpoint is even if it means sacrificing one night of not enough or not great sleep, it's better to stick to that consistency as much as possible. So if you have a night where you don't get to sleep on time, you still ideally want to wake up around the same time that you would normally wake up so that your schedule then continues to be regulated. Helping your child have a bedtime routine that they know just kind of sets them to get ready for bed is helpful for sleep hygiene. It's kind of they know what to expect and what comes next. You've probably heard all of the research on electronics, but the blue light in all of our electronics devices it discourages the production of melatonin in the brain. If you've ever taken melatonin to sleep, you know that melatonin helps your sleep cycle get started, so you don't want to disrupt the melatonin. This is why all the experts say put your device away an hour before you want to go to bed. Otherwise, it's tricking your brain into being awake. This is hard for a lot of kids, who are kind of glued to the devices, but really setting that as an expectation of if bedtime is 10 o'clock, devices go off at 9, they're plugged into their chargers, which is ideally in a different room, and they're left there until morning. And especially if you wake up during the night, I hear this a lot from teenagers. They sleep with their phone right here. They wake up at 3 a.m. to go to the bathroom. They look at their phone, and then all of a sudden they're wide awake. So really having them in another room, reducing the temptation is really important. Also, one of the things that we know is that if you use your bed for other things than sleeping, you start to associate your bed with being awake. So beds are for sleeping. Where this is important, particularly for teenagers, is a lot of teenagers come home, they sit on their bed and they do their homework. This sounds like it's relatively innocuous, but then their body, when it's bedtime, associates that bed with being awake, and sometimes with being stressed if they're stressed when doing their homework, which makes it harder for them to fall asleep. So really having that expectation of when we're not asleep, beds are, we don't sit on our bed, we don't do anything in bed until we're ready for sleep. Daily exercise is another thing that's often compromised when we're stressed, but that also helps regulate your sleep cycles. So getting some exercise every day helps prepare your body for sleep. Ideally, if it's not right before sleep, which can kind of wake you up, but earlier in the day. And ideally some exposure to daylight too. So whether that's the exercises outside or even just being outside for 15 minutes a day, we know that some exposure to the sun actually helps regulate that melatonin cycle in your brain and helps you sleep better. This is part of why people have trouble with sleep and other types of symptoms in the wintertime because of that lack of exposure to the sunlight. One of the kind of paradoxical sleep things is that the longer you stay in bed trying to sleep, the worse it's going to make your insomnia. So one of the things that we know is that if you spent more than 20 minutes tossing and turning in bed and you can't sleep, you shouldn't stay in bed. Even though you're tired and that's all you want to do, you should actually get out of bed, sit in a comfy chair in low light, read a book, do something relaxing, don't go on a screen, until you feel sleepy again, and then return to bed. And the reason is otherwise, again, your body associates the bed with being awake, and it becomes this kind of self-productive cycle of every night you go to bed, you're tossing and turning, the next night you're more likely to be doing the same. Ideally, you want to put kids to sleep when they're drowsy but still awake. This is more so for younger kids. Sometimes we wait until kids fall asleep on the couch, carry them up to bed. But what that does is it doesn't allow them to kind of develop these good sleep hygiene strategies early on. So we want them to be drowsy enough that they're likely to fall asleep, but not asleep already, so that they can get used to falling asleep in their own bed. And then just keeping those bedtime checks short and sweet. That's partially, what we've talked about, reassurance, not letting that become a source of reassurance, but also not letting that kind of discourage the bedtime routine. Another thing for stress management, stress and procrastination go hand in hand. The more you procrastinate, the more stressed you're going to be. But interestingly, the more stressed you are, the more you procrastinate. And the reason for that is that a lot of people think procrastination is laziness. One of the definitions of procrastination is actually avoidance. So procrastination is avoidance of something that feels too overwhelming to start. When stress gets too high, kids are more likely to procrastinate, not always necessarily because they would just like to be doing something else, but because the idea of getting started on the task is overwhelming. So when we see that type of procrastination occurring, we want to distinguish it and understand that it's not laziness. We want to help children identify why they're procrastinating. This is avoidance, and helping them understand that the more you avoid something that you're anxious about, the scarier that thing becomes. And most kids can relate to that in other areas of their life. If they've avoided something that's scary, and then the idea of going back and doing it feels even more scary, kind of equating that to the procrastination. The longer you put off this project, the scarier it's going to feel. So how can we break it down to help you get started? We mentioned perfectionism before. Sometimes that can cause that procrastination because children have certain rules associated with how they have to do something, which makes them want to procrastinate it. And then this is where you can work with your child to imagine they're outsourcing the task. What would you do to tell somebody else to get it done? Let's write down those steps. Let's start with step 1 together. Often the first step is the hardest part. Once you get started, it's not that bad after that. So it's really working on reinforcing, getting your child started and then reinforcing them for getting started. Helping children prioritize when they're feeling overwhelmed. This is particularly important for parents of middle and high schoolers who have so much homework that it can be very overwhelming. How do we prioritize what's due sooner, what's worth more credit, what's more important for the percentage of your grade, what's based on accuracy and what's just based on completion. So the kids that I work with who are perfectionists might spend hours perfecting a math assignment that's really graded just on whether or not you did it. that's not really all that helpful to them, partially because it takes away time from all the other things that they need to be doing, but also because it's not reinforcing the skill if they're perfecting this thing that doesn't need to be perfected. So really helping your child prioritize what are the things that just need to be done, and maybe the thing you teach them is it just needs to be done good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be good enough. Can we get those things done and then spend more time on the things that maybe are more important or graded on accuracy? Yes.
So obviously I have a kid who has trouble managing stress, which is why Dad's here today. One of the things to help her manage her stress that she uses as a coping technique is she likes to watch a show on an iPad sitting next to her while she's doing her homework. And while Dad has used the power of Google to highlight that's not really effective, helpful, I'm obviously not broken through on that. How do I help her break this crutch? Like, she is struggling, right? So we're kind of drawn up a lot of hard boundaries, but I really feel like it is inhibiting her, it's delaying her, it's distracting her, it's not being effective with her time, it's impacting the prioritization. What are tools we can use in the home to get her to buy into this? Because me just throwing down with her and locking up the iPad is a technique, but it's not going to really, it's going to cause me other problems.
Right, that's a great question. So if you're using an iPad or other things for distraction or music while you're doing your homework, but it's this kind of crutch of I feel like I need to have this here to cope with the stress to get it done, but we know that it's also distracting.
Like soothing music, you know, like it's some kind of intense Netflix show.
Right,
I don't know how she has the password to it.
right, yeah. Yeah, so other than locking down the iPad, what can we do? I mean, some of it we can explain, and I know you've done that through Google, that idea of any type of distraction from stress and anxiety is like a Band-Aid. It's covering it up, but it's not actually doing anything to target what's underneath the surface. So the idea being that using that, she might feel like it's helping her get through homework that day, but it's not actually helping her learn how to get through the stress of doing homework. So from that kind of cognitive understanding of this is something that you feel like is helpful right now, but it's really not going to be helpful long term because you're going to grow more dependent on it, which is also challenging if you have to do work in school and the iPad isn't there. You know, that idea of homework is where we practice what we have to do in school. We really want to practice it in a similar way to how we're going to be doing it in school so that we're prepared to do it in school. So there's that kind of underlying understanding of how it works to help try to get her buy-in, and then maybe trying breaking it down step by step. So I understand you feel like you need to have the Netflix to get your tough homework done. Can we work to do 10 minutes of it with a timer first without the Netflix, and then for now, not that this is our long-term goal, for now then the rest of it you can have Netflix on, and then tomorrow can we do 15 minutes without the Netflix, and then kind of scaffolding it from there and essentially teaching her that she can do it without Netflix there, but in small chunks so that she can really kind of test her limits and challenge herself and build some success with it over time. And then what we would expect is once she's doing it without Netflix, she would actually see, oh wow, I'm getting this done a lot faster. And then Netflix could be her reward. You know, when you're done with homework and you don't have any more stress and you get to just sit and enjoy, then you can watch your show. And so, you know, really teaching her then it's that contingency. But for now, if she's kind of attached to it, you kind of help her see, okay, right now this is like a crutch, and our goal is going to be to kind of gradually remove that crutch over time. And so that may be one way to do that. That is a common thing, you know, kids say, I can't focus without the TV on. That you can also really help them understand that from a scientific perspective, nobody multitasks. We all like to think that we do, but you've probably seen multiple people almost rear-end you because they're texting and driving. We know that people really can't multitask. They've actually looked at brain waves, and when you're focusing on one thing, you are not focusing on something else. So as good as we think we are at multitasking, we really just have ways to switch back and forth between stuff, and some people can do that faster than others, so it looks like they're multitasking. But multitasking is really a myth. So when kids tell me, oh, you know, I'm a multitasker, I really have to be watching TV to do my homework, I say, you know, scientifically, that's really not a thing. And then explain that to them so that they understand you're really just switching back and forth really quickly between the two, and that's actually inhibiting you, and it's probably making your homework take a whole lot longer than you want it to. And so if they understand, hey, maybe I could be getting this done faster, then they're maybe a little bit more bought into it. So other things that we can do after reinforcing your child for getting started, prioritizing when they're overwhelmed, and then we kind of just talked about it, but minimizing those distractions, other sources of instant gratification. I always tell people, put your phone in another room when you're doing homework. No kid likes to hear that, but it's the idea of there's that constant pinging that's right there. You think it's not distracting, but it is. So your phone can be a reward when homework is done, but it shouldn't be there when homework is happening, because then it's just a distraction.
So like if they get their assignments on their phone, so get those assignments off. I'm a grandmother who takes care of after school. Get those assignments off the phone first.
So that's what I would recommend. That's why I say sitting down, because this is a really common question. Well, everything's on the computer now. What do I do? Because the computer is so distracting. You sit down, you write down everything that you find, all the assignments on Blackboard, you write them down so you know what it is. And then what I typically recommend is break it, like chunk it into two. There's homework that doesn't require a computer and homework that does. When you're doing homework that doesn't require a computer, the computer should be closed and in another room. When you're doing homework that does require a computer, it's obviously more challenging because it's so easy to pull up another web browser. If it's not on the internet, you can turn off the Wi-Fi and you can just do, you know, reading, whatever it is on the computer. That minimizes some of the temptation. If it's reading, this is not the most environmentally friendly approach, but you can print it out and do it that way so that you don't have the temptation of the computer. And then if it's something that's online, that's where it's kind of teaching your child those skills. Hopefully, you know, a lot of this is something that we're going to be dealing with, you know, from here on out. So hopefully this is an opportunity for kids to learn these skills now and then implement them later in life. But that idea of, okay, how do we kind of structure our time, close everything down, do the homework until the timer goes off, and then, you know, allow ourselves to take a break and look at other things, but not allow your brain to take those unexpected breaks that derail you from the progress. So as much as you can eliminate the computer, that's one way, but also teaching them those skills, because they will be using computers and they use them in school now too. So being able to learn, how do I kind of minimize some of those distractions for myself?
So how do you recommend, though, my senior does his math homework, like the computer's up during the math homework, and then there's papers of math homework. Meanwhile, they've got group texts going, and he claims they're talking about the homework. And you know, so it's like, how do you figure out, okay, well, have you been distracted? Because, I mean, this is math I never did, so I do believe there is some group texting going on, but then, yeah, how do you figure out, oh no, you don't put the phone away while you're doing your math homework, yet, you know, they don't use that $100 calculator anymore because they've got the apps on their phone to do the physics. I'm like, how do you tell where it's stopping and crossing over, and, you know, you got 3 things open. I'm like, yeah, I have 3 monitors at work. I'm like, how do you say no when you know full well, I got 3 monitors?
Is it a problem though?
I know, yeah.
Is it bad in math? If it's not, then
And he's not failing now, he's, you
then it's
know,
not a problem.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is the question of, is it a problem? If it is a problem, and you do feel like your child's getting sucked into the phone, and maybe they're claiming, I need it to ask for help, you might say, okay, we're going to go through and do all the homework, and then you're going to have a time at the end of homework where you can text your friends and ask for help. Or, you know, novel idea, call them and go through all the problems there. But that idea being that really you kind of save all of those questions until the end so that you're not constantly being distracted by the texting. So it may be true that, you know, the homework is really complex and they do need to ask their friends about it, but you say, try to do everything you can on your own. When you get to the end, write down all your questions, then you can text your friends. So that's one way to minimize some of the phone distraction.
Yeah, just on that, my daughter's been doing that occasionally, and doing it like a tutoring session, like we would have at university, where you would, you know, do your course with the professor, and then you'd be in a room with a tutor and maybe 10 other uni kids.
Yeah.
And they're all comparing ideas, and yeah, there's some social chit chat, that's true. but they're also saying, how did you do this bit of trig? You know, I don't get it, and someone's explaining it to them. So, you know, it's hard for us to take it, because it's on
Yeah,
our
how
way
do I
of
say,
doing
like,
it.
just get in your car and drive there?
But there's some positives as well.
Yeah.
It's a different world.
Yeah, it's identifying the good and then trying to minimize the distractions. You're right. I mean, some of it is that they really are using the internet for useful things, but it's how do you teach them? Because we all have this challenge at work too, right? You know, most of us have, like you said, several browsers. You're sitting in front of a computer. You do have the option to constantly be surfing the web or online shopping or whatever it is that you might do, but you make the choice not to do it because you're trying to get your work done. And it's really kind of teaching your child some of those skills now so that they have them later, but trying to minimize some of the distractions and temptation and finding the good things that they can use and then kind of trying to get rid of some of the not so good.
And they're the same skills we had to learn too. We had study groups, and some study groups were great, and you actually
That's true.
studied. Other study groups, you chit-chatted and didn't get much done, and then that was our mistake, and that's what we had to learn from and find better study groups. So
Right,
they're
that's
learning
true.
the same skills that we had to learn, just in it's a different environment.
Mhm. Right. Yeah, so moving to some other stress management techniques. These are some examples of things that you might teach your child when they're feeling stressed. Deep breathing, I generally teach to kids by telling them to put a hand on their chest and a hand on their stomach. When you're breathing deeply, the hand on your chest should really be kind of staying still. A lot of people think of deep breaths as like panting. You actually want to be kind of filling your diaphragm with air. And so if you're taking a really deep breath, you can feel your stomach expanding and then contracting when you're breathing out. I also teach kids to breathe slowly. I don't generally tell them they have to count to a certain number because everybody's lung capacity is different. But let's say you count in for 3, then you want to count out for 3. You don't have to hold your breath in the middle. But you don't want to breathe in really slowly and then breathe out really fast. So you want to kind of match in slow, out slow. Progressive muscle relaxation, I mean, you can YouTube this and kind of hear some example videos of it, but it's this idea of kind of tensing, starting at your toes and working your way up your body, kind of tensing and releasing muscles. It can be helpful if a child's feeling really stressed to kind of, one, take their mind off of the moment and kind of help them kind of focus and be present, and then also help them kind of relax their body and then return to what it is that they're doing. The 5-4-3-2-1 technique is a mindfulness technique. It's your 5 senses, and the idea is that it's supposed to bring you back to the present. So you might say, okay, let's find 5 things in the room that we can hear. And then let's identify 4 things in the room that we can smell. Let's identify 3 things in the room that we can see, and kind of going through the 5 senses. It's just an exercise to help children focus on being present and can help kind of reduce stress in the moment. Meditation sounds really fancy. One way to explain meditation to kids is that it's essentially sort of trying to be able to watch your thoughts go by almost like they're cars driving down the road, but not attach yourself to them. So when you're meditating, you might be taking deep breaths. You might see a thought go by. You recognize that it's there, but you don't necessarily attend to it. So you just kind of let it go and then bring yourself back to the breathing. And then taking brain breaks when you're doing homework. This can be helpful, like we said, with that chunking. So working, taking a break, working, taking a break. This is just, I thought, a helpful graphic, kind of kid-friendly. Here are some things that we can do. There are emotion-focused coping skills, so these are the things that help you feel emotionally better. And then there are problem-focused, so things that we can actually do to work on responding to stress and sorting out those problems. So this might just be a helpful thing to share with younger kids. So we've already talked a little bit about technology, but I get a lot of questions about what's the effect of technology on stress. The short answer is we don't fully know yet because it's still so new. And you know, the generations now are the ones that are growing up with technology in a different way than we did. And so we're still really collecting a lot of information. We know that technology is not all bad. And some use of technology, even social media and things like that, is not necessarily bad, but it's the amount to which you use it. And the research that we do have suggests that when you're using technology, this would be all screens used for fun, like TV, computer, iPad, phone, lumped in together for about 2 hours a day. It doesn't have an effect. When it's more than that, it can start to negatively affect you in terms of anxiety, depression, and then also kind of stress in getting things done. So the idea being that really what we want to do with technology, we're never going to get rid of it, we just want to set healthy limits with it and help model those to our kids and then help them learn, how do I use technology effectively, but how do I also separate myself from it so that I can remain healthy. So you might model moderation in your own use of screens. You'd have clear boundaries that ideally everybody adheres to. This is a complaint I get a lot from kids that I'm working with of why do I have these rules and my mom and dad don't. So to avoid that, ideally you have family rules, like nobody uses their phone at the dinner table. Everybody plugs their phone in at 9 o'clock at night somewhere in a central area and doesn't bring it to bed. We don't have our phones out during homework time, and parents might model this if they're doing work at home. Screens never belong in bed, and then moderating that overall screen time, so ideally having limits on it. One way to do this is just trying to really encourage your kids to get involved in other activities that don't involve screens. That can be helpful because the more that they're going to practice and doing other things, the less time they have to sit and be at home on their screens. But also, even if they are at home on their screens, saying we're going to have a limit on screen time. And there's a lot of pushback from that, and I get it. Most parents do it. So when I have kids tell me, like, my friends are on their screens all day, we talk about that's their perception, and that may or may not be true. But these days, really, most parents do have limits on screen time, and just setting it as is an expectation for our family to be healthy, just like we wouldn't let you eat pizza for every meal. This is the same idea here, that we're going to set some of these healthy limits for our family.
But let me ask you a question here. First of all, we talked before about the kids doing also homework, studying on the screen. So the 2 hours would not all be fun. I mean, if they're going to say, we want to watch a show, we want to chat with our friends, play a computer game, but they have already done 1 hour, 45 minutes of homework, maybe that's a bit tight. I don't know. The other thing, the fact that the rules should apply to parents, I fully agree, and I think at our home we do pretty well, except with the time limit. I'm at the moment in a phase where I work a lot from home, or at least, I work part of the day from home, and I work odd hours, so they do see me on the iPad, but I'm not playing computer games. I would promise them to them. But still, given that I have duties that need to be performed online, it is very difficult to model that.
The 2 hours, you're right, the 2 hours is really recreational screen time, so you can distinguish that and say that the 2 hours is outside of homework, the caveat being that when you're doing your homework, you're really doing your homework, you're not playing computer games, procrastinating doing your homework. And that would be the thing that you would be modeling. When I'm doing my work, I'm sitting here doing my work, the TV isn't on, you're seeing I'm working, I'm in my office, whatever it is that you may be doing, and you're modeling when I'm working, and then when we're, as a family using recreational screen time, that's separate. So you're right that it is, that the research is on recreational screen time, so not necessarily screens that are used for work or homework. But that's a good distinguisher. So other things that you want to do is avoid using technology as an emotional pacifier, because that can become also kind of addictive. Like if you use it to calm your child down, then the next time they're upset, they expect the technology to calm them down. This starts young these days, where you might use it in the car as an emotional pacifier. The problem being, if you're using it as a reaction to an emotional outburst, then the expectation is that technology is used for that, and it also doesn't give the child a chance to cope with the emotional situation. It's really just a distraction, and so they're not really learning from that experience. And then just teaching digital literacy, and that's just being aware, teaching your children what's out there, how to use the internet effectively, how to look out for things, how to communicate with you, really ideally keeping an open line of communication if your child does see things that are upsetting, really encouraging them to talk about those things as a family. And then, we mentioned earlier that we all experience stress. One of the things that can be helpful is just trying to reduce your own stress. So modeling those positive coping skills, looking at your own lifestyle and how you model stress coping, and all of those basic needs and your schedule, and am I making time for sleep, and those types of things. Am I showing my child that I'm prioritizing self-care even at times when I'm stressed? Modeling those executive functioning skills, a healthy work-life balance as much as possible. Modeling asking for help when needed too, which is also another good executive functioning skill. And then a question I get a lot, because I work with people with anxiety, is stress versus anxiety. When should I do something about this? There's no perfect answer to that. The biggest thing is when it's inhibiting functioning, when you've tried all of these coping skills and you're still seeing difficulties with functioning, where it's affecting sleep, eating, going to school, daily life type things. That's when you might seek some help. And the ways that you might talk to your child about doing that, really, I explain a lot of what I do is cognitive behavioral therapy is really skill-based and goal-oriented. The idea is that you're practicing a skill almost like exercising a muscle until you get better at it. And then as you get better at it, you go on your happy way. And that's one way that I explain it to kids is you're not coming here to talk to me to lay on my couch and tell me your problems for the rest of your life, or because you have a problem or there's something wrong with you. You're coming to learn a skill. Much like your soccer coach teaches you to be a better player and engages you in doing drills and has you practice them until you get better at them, that's really what the goal of therapy and stress management and anxiety should be. If you have questions about managing anxiety, a lot of people wonder about therapy versus medication. For some things, medication is a frontline treatment. For stress and anxiety, therapy is really effective. So when they do these controlled trials and they look at therapy plus medication, medication alone or nothing, therapy alone is very effective long-term for anxiety, which is great. There's no side effects. So the effectiveness is really good. I often recommend starting there because it can be very effective on its own. In some cases, when anxiety is so high, you might do a combination of the two, and that's really helpful. But I always recommend starting, if you're concerned about long-term stress and anxiety, starting with therapy because that alone can be very successful. Other things that you can do are look for resources at school. The fact that you're here, you're probably accessing these resources already, which is great. The Parent Resource Center in Fairfax County Schools is a great resource. Your school itself also likely has resources as well. So you might talk with teachers or school counselors, school psychologists are great resources, and talk to them about what are some ways that I can help with that kind of homeschool collaboration to help my child manage stress. In some cases, accommodations may be relevant if you have diagnosed anxiety, and accommodations would be something like having extra time to complete tests or shortened homework assignments or things like that. Those would be, they're there as needed. If you do need them, they should be tailored to the individual student. But even outside of like a formal accommodation plan, there are a lot of resources that the school can ask or can offer. And then one of the big things that you want to do in asking the school for help is teaching your child how you're doing it. So a lot of times we know how to ask for help as adults. Kids don't necessarily. If you involve them in the process, you're actually teaching them to be a really good advocate for themselves, which is really important long term, especially as they get into middle and high school when they're going to be doing a lot more of the face-to-face interactions with teachers. You really want them to have those skills to be able to ask for help themselves, and part of how you do that is you involve them in the process when they're young. All right, so I know we've had some questions so far, but if we have more questions, please feel free to ask them. And I think if you don't have questions, you're welcome to kind of sneak out. But otherwise, we can kind of just have the remaining time for questions. Yes?
Yes, so please, wonderful. Thank you so much. Before we start our questions, thank you.
Thank you.
You all took evaluations before you came in. Please make sure to fill those out and drop them off at the table here. And Dr. Bateman, if you wouldn't mind repeating their questions,
Okay.
just so we can pick those up on the video.
Sure.
Thank you.
All right. Yes.
So I have twin 9.5-year-old girls, and one of them suffers severely with what we're talking about today, and some ones that it's gone. I think one of your first slides, sorry, talked about, like GI problems. So she has taken this stress, which I still have not figured out what that is yet, so I'm glad to be here and to know there's other help. But she has a twin, who is the flamboyant and here, right, just like we talked at the beginning, no fear, I'm gonna go for it, blah, 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 and she's just, extremely sensitive, like, you say boo, and it's like, what do I do, But it's internalized it so bad that she's sick now, so, I'm trying to figure out, ways to help that, but I know technology is, unfortunately, like, even at school, they told her, like, when you need to go to the bathroom, you can take, she can take a book, she can take one of the teacher's phones, or she can take something, to kind of distract her while she's sitting in the class, if she starts feeling this anxiety, because it makes all of a sudden she gets sick. Like, they're giving her things to distract that, so I'm confused now on, like, what you were saying about the coping, like, now this has become her crutch, I guess, so I'm wondering if there's something you could talk about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was that we have a child who's feeling stressed and anxious to the point where it's causing GI problems, and the child feels physically ill. And one of the challenges is that, while the school has, been helpful in allowing her to escape and take a break when she needs it, that they've been using some kind of coping mechanisms like a phone or a book as distractions, and what to do in the moment, because then she kind of relies on those to help her. So that's a great question, and I think talking with the school about the fact that they've given her an accommodation to leave the classroom if she needs it is not necessarily a bad thing, but could there be an accommodation where she walks with a school counselor and talks to the counselor about how she's feeling, so that she has to identify some of the sources of stress rather than just kind of masking them with the technology. But if she spent 5 minutes kind of walking the halls with the school counselor, talking about how she felt and some strategies for returning to the class, that would be a much more effective long-term approach than just that escape approach. And ideally, gradually we want her to be able to kind of cope with the feelings in the classroom, but part of it is we have to kind of teach her how to do that. So that's one of the things I would consider is, talking with the teacher, is there a resource like that where there's somewhere she could go where she's really facing the feelings that she's having rather than distracting herself from them. And then the big thing with escaping, particularly with some of those kind of somatic concerns, is that the goal is you always want the child to return to the environment, because you don't want them to escape forever, because then that becomes kind of a coping mechanism. So you want to say, okay, I understand you're feeling anxious, let's talk about how to work through it together, and then let's go back to class and work on facing whatever it is that you're feeling anxious. But I think a little bit more scaffolding for her would be helpful in those moments. And then from the GI perspective, one of the things I always recommend explaining to kids is that connection between the brain and the gut. And it's actually really kind of interesting. It goes back to when your child is developing in the womb. So the cells that go to develop the brain, when your child's just a little embryo, they're the same cells that split off and go to the gut. So there's actually a biological connection between the two, which is why when you feel anxious, you feel it in your stomach. That's why when some people feel anxious, they actually feel sick to the point of vomiting. There is that kind of biological reason for it, and sometimes it helps kids to understand that, because if they understand what's causing the stomach ache, then they might be able to cope more effectively with it, versus if they don't know what's causing it. They can understand, okay, this is my brain playing tricks on me. If I can manage the stress, my stomach will start feeling better too. So even explaining that connection can be helpful too. Yeah. Yes.
I'm a big believer in sleep. I love sleep for your health. And I have 5 kids, and 4 of them I have successfully put them on a routine. We go to bed early, we get up early. It's the whole thing. We're great. Except for my oldest teenager. I've been trying to program her since she was a newborn, and I'm whatever. So she doesn't wake up. Her brain is not functioning until late, and she's also a perfectionist at her schoolwork. So it's just this compounding problem that I see. It's leading in bad places all over the place, and I just wish she would just sleep. And now I also see that getting up early for school, it's too early for her, and she's not awake. And so when she gets home, she's tired, immediately wants to take a nap, but I'm nagging her to get up and start her homework. But then she stays up late because of all this delay, and it's the cycle. Now, I've tried to schedule things with her. What homework do you have? How long will it take? Kind of like what you were saying. And it's worked great. So should I schedule, a 10-minute nap in there? See, I don't know what to do with her.
That's a great question. So the question is, if you have a teenager who has trouble sleeping and trouble getting up in the morning, trouble going to sleep at night, plus all of this homework that's delaying the sleep, and then they're so exhausted when they get home from school that they take a nap, how do we help them get on a schedule? And this is a really common concern. Also, biologically, teenagers are programmed to go to bed later and wake up later, so it's not really all that helpful that high school starts so early. When I was in high school, I actually did a persuasive speech on how school should start later, because biologically there's actually a reason for it. It won't change because of extracurricular activities and all of that, but there is this reason that kids do kind of feel so sleepy in the morning and they stay up so late. Some of it is biological, so we're kind of working against their biological clocks, but what we really want to do is help them establish good habits. So one of the questions is about napping. Napping is a challenge because if you have a really tired child who comes home from school, a lot of times I see this, naps for 3 hours and then starts homework at 9 o'clock at night, and then they're up until 2, and then they fall asleep, and then they get 4 hours of sleep, and then they wake up and they start it all over again. You're never going to break that cycle. So really the best recommendation sleep experts have is that you don't nap no matter how tired you are. Sometimes that's easier said than done. If anything, you limit the nap to like a 20-minute power nap. You set a timer, you wake them up, you do what you have to do to get them up, whether it's taking the covers off or, I know it can be hard at times to get them up and out of bed, but the idea being that if you do like a long afternoon nap, it's just going to further disrupt that cycle. And then part of the question was that perfectionism with homework. What I do with kids who are perfectionistic related to OCD, this is part of that exposure. So exposure is kind of facing your fear, and for a perfectionist, facing your fear, it means facing doing something not perfectly and turning it in the way that it is, but it helps you overcome that perfectionism that's not always helpful. And so part of how you might do that is you say, we have a cutoff time, homework, even if you want to stay up late, which probably, hopefully she won't if she's tired, but even if your homework is not done, homework stops at 10 o'clock at night. Maybe that's depending on when she needs to go to bed, but there's like a cutoff time, whether your homework is done or not, it stops at that time. Part of that is then helping your child have to budget their time of, I can't do this perfectly, otherwise it'll take until 10 and then I won't do any of my other homework, which is good for overcoming the perfectionism. And it also teaches them that as much as you want to stay up late doing homework, we're not going to kind of compromise on sleep for the homework, even if it means that you don't get an assignment done, which is actually, again, maybe one of those kind of safe learning mistakes of I cannot get a homework assignment done and life still goes on and things are okay. Yeah. Do you have a question back there?
I actually wanted to throw out a resource that the app Calm, which has a free version, has a napping sleep story, almost where it's like 23 minutes, where it does a very brief intro and then it wakes you up with like Jump Bird song. I've done it with my own 12-year-old and 10-year-old, and it works very well and keeps them from that 3-hour nap is dangerous.
That's great to know. Thank you. Yes. Yes, question?
Yes, you talked about them building resiliency and learning resiliency. How can you encourage your child if they already are like afraid to take risks? If they kind of already have that mindset of just being afraid to do something because of failure, especially if they're seniors and almost 18 and think they know everything.
It's definitely hard, yes. So the question was, how do you encourage a child who may be fearful to try new things or maybe avoidant of that failure or not wanting to try things, especially once they're older and maybe not as bought into the process. You can look for like examples of ways that they faced their fears before and had success and try to build upon those things. So, with younger kids, a lot of times if I'm talking to them about facing their fears, I'll ask them if they remember when they learned to ride a bike or when they learned to like put their head in the water when they're swimming, because those are often scary the first time you do them. Most kids, if it's recent, they kind of remember it and they can make that connection to doing something that was really hard that now feels basically automatic because they've done it so much ever since. And so with someone who's 18, it might be other examples of like the first time that she talked to a cute boy in school, or the first time that she invited a friend over that she had never invited over before, and that it was kind of scary and she didn't know if they were going to say yes or no, and they said yes and they came over and she had a great time. Kind of like looking for those examples of, okay, what are some things you've pushed yourself to do before? What happened as a result of it? And are you glad that it happened? And then kind of being able to say, okay, you know, particularly as you're 18 and you're getting ready to go on and live your life, you've got a choice where you can kind of let your life be safe and small in this box that feels comfortable to you. And that's one choice that you can make, and some people choose to live their lives like that. But think of all the things that you've done and that you've enjoyed when you've pushed yourself out of that box, and think about, okay, so do I want my box to get a little bit bigger? And then maybe talking with her, what are some of the small things that you would like to see? What are some of the small experiences you might like to be able to have as an 18-year-old? And maybe it would be something like her first time driving somewhere by herself, or her first time like meeting friends out, or something that might feel adult and scary but fun at the same time, and being able to say, okay, can we plan that experience together? Can we see how it goes successfully? And then can we use that as a building block for bigger challenges, like trying something new? Yes?
Good question. I have elementary school kids, and what we have done is, with all the issues that everybody else mentioned, doing homework and all that, we don't have any screen time, not allowed during the week, but we are sort of connecting it to a reward program. So if you do this, your homework on time, and sleep, and breakfast, and getting up, then you get the screen time on the weekend, or other rewards. So their elementary school, it has worked semi-well. But I'm just worried that on the long term, when they get into middle school or high school, is that going to have will it build a bad effect? Is it something they always will expect? Or is it a good practice to do? Or we shouldn't connect this to reward?
Yeah, so the question was using rewards to incentivize doing homework. So for example, if your child does their homework on time and gets it done during the week, then they have screen time on the weekends. And setting that up as a precedent when they're young, is that going to cause problems later on? And the kind of general answer is no, not necessarily, as long as you're kind of teaching them to make connections between the effort and the reward. So like we said, that idea that the research shows if you're rewarding effort, that actually contributes to internal motivation. If you're rewarding achievement, it can do the opposite. So as long as you're connecting the reinforcer to the effort that the child is putting forth, that's a good thing. One of the things that you might consider with rewards is that immediacy of rewards is more effective. So sometimes having it, particularly for really young kids, having it like right after they do the thing that's hard, having access to the thing that they enjoy. One of the ways that you might scaffold this, particularly as your kids get older, if you're not able to always give like lots of free time or fun things as the reward, is to use something that's called the PREMAC principle, which sounds fancy, but it's really just this idea of first you do the thing that you don't really want to do, and then you do the thing that's a little bit more enjoyable. Most of us do this in the context of our daily life. You do the laundry before you sit down and watch TV. You try to make yourself do the hard things first, so then you can do the things that you enjoy. So sometimes you might use that as a strategy too, so it's not even always just screen time, but you might even use other reinforcers too, or that PREMAC principle of first you do the hard thing, then you do the thing that's a little bit more enjoyable. But the short answer is that reward systems are not bad. A lot of people worry about, am I bribing my child? You're not really. I mean, most of us, would you show up to work if you stopped getting your paycheck? Right, so like we all do operate under that system, whether we think about it or not. We all respond to consequences and rewards, and kids are no different. So kind of expecting them that they wouldn't respond to that, it makes sense that we would use that as an incentive, because most of us need incentives to do the things that we don't want to do. Yeah. Yes?
Any advice for helping a 10-year-old, get their flu shot? Because my daughter has like a severe fear of, and needles all of her life, and she, you know, when it comes to getting shots, I mean, there's been huge, you know, meltdowns at the pediatrician and everything all through her life. So she's already asking, like, when am I gonna get it? Oh my God, and she's just so focused on it, and, you know, the appointment's a month away still, but she's just so amped about it.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So the question is what to do for a child who's afraid of vaccines, this is a really common phobia, fear of needles or injections. So exposure therapy works really well for this. The idea of exposure therapy, it's a gradual, effective exposure to the thing that's feared. So I do this in my practice. I recently did it with an adult who went 40 years without getting any shots and then was able to successfully go back and get some shots, which is great. So the idea, it is effective, and you might explain that, like this really does work for people. You generally start with low-level exposures, and that might be looking at pictures of needles. You can go to a pharmacy and request a needle like that you can buy to have at home, looking at the needle itself. I know you have to sign a waiver because they ask what you're using it for, but they do that if you want to do that. You can look at pictures, you can look at videos. The idea of exposure is it's gradual desensitization. So you see the needles enough times, you see somebody getting a shot, you see pictures, videos, you gradually kind of desensitize to it. You see the needle itself. I've done practices where I have those little squeeze stress balls and a needle, and you kind of put the needle in the stress ball because that's what it looks like when you kind of puncture the skin. It goes in and then it comes out, and then, you know, the hole kind of closes up. And so it's a good visual of like, this is what happens when you're getting a shot. Sometimes you can do practices of going to the doctor's office without getting a shot. So even like the practice of going and sitting in the waiting room, sitting on the table, talking about the shot, going home and leaving, and then kind of working up to actually getting the shot itself. But the idea is that, you know, our temptation is to avoid talking about it because it causes so much stress. You actually want to kind of gradually face it to prepare her for it, and just keep working on kind of desensitizing her to that idea. And that you can validate her fears. Like, a lot of people feel afraid of this. And I always tell people with needle phobias, like, you're never going to love it. Like, that's not the goal. You're not going to get to a point where, like, shots are fun. But really that you're going to get to a point where a shot is just a thing that you have to do, and you do it, and it's not so bad. And so even helping her understand, like, I know you don't like this, and I know that it's uncomfortable, but we can help you get to a point where it's just a thing that you're going to have to do, and you can get through it. Yeah.
Can I add to that? My daughter was doing, you know, the cognitive behavioral therapy too, and for trying to get over those fears, not with needles but other ones, to help really show and prove to her that it worked, she would rate her anxiety at the beginning and then rate her anxiety after. So at first they were very high levels before and after the exposure, but then the next time the anxiety was a little bit lower and a little bit lower after the exposure, and finally she could really see that, yeah, she had a lot of anxiety before, but then after she saw the needle, or after she saw had the experience, she could see her, and she would write it down and track it, and it was pretty remarkable. Then it reinforced for her to actually see the numbers and see that her anxiety was going down. It proves that it works.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. Good. All right. Looks like yes, thank you for coming. I hope everybody has a nice weekend.